Over 1,000 rebels mobilized in Dublin on Easter Monday, 1916. They weren't all men. A significant number were women. Many of these women recorded detailed eyewitness accounts of the battle on the streets of the city.
We saw Ned daily and handed over the ammunition.
And women who opposed the rebellion also wrote accounts. While fearless in the face of enemy fire, some questioned the decision to take up arms.
I told him that I felt that the rebellion was a frightful mistake, because it could not possibly succeed and was therefore wrong.
Were they given proper recognition in history? Well, the categoric answer is no.
It was good to be in action. More than once I saw the man I aimed at fall.
This woman who led men in battle, who was shot, is turned down for a military pension because the assumption is that to be a combatant is to be male.
These women showed no less courage during the Rising than their male counterparts. Many of them believed that the republic they fought for would make them equal citizens. But women were far from equal in independent Ireland, and their involvement in 1916 was largely forgotten.
Women did not gain anything from Irish independence. They would have been better off to have remained part of the United Kingdom.
7 women tells their stories through their eyes and in their words. The Easter Proclamation guaranteed both Irish men and Irish women religious and civil liberty, equal rights and equal opportunities. It was a remarkable declaration. The proclamation proposed to transform Irish society's rigid conservative values. In a new Ireland, women would be the equals of men, just as free to pursue careers and be politically active. As it was, women were still unable to vote in national elections, while most men could.
By 1916, you had a really vibrant women's movement operating on lots of different levels, which was constantly challenging the sort of expected place of men and women in society to a certain degree. You've got a lot of women who are suffragists, feminists, who believe that women should have equal representation, who should be politically active and so on. And then you have the backdrop of Home Rule and the movement for independence.
They tend to come, I think, from the Catholic middle class and lower middle class and skilled working class backgrounds.
They tended to be independent in different ways, often well educated, often from a better background than other people.
This new generation of radical nationalist women was determined to secure the vote. They also formed organisations such as Inine na hÉireann and later Cumann na mBan to advance the national cause.
I'd say a lot of these women had aspirations, social aspirations, which they felt could be fulfilled more meaningfully if Ireland had its independence or some degree of independence from Britain. You had people like that who were very angry with the system, couldn't live possibly the type of lives they really would have wanted to live.
It's a time where so much was up for grabs, to use a sort of modern expression, and it's an incredibly volatile, dynamic period.
Out of this charged political landscape arose our 7 women, all sharing one goal, a united and independent Irish Republic. They were nurses, political activists, teachers, promoters of the Irish language, trade unionists, and even a schoolgirl. In the decades that followed, these women wrote about their experiences. Some submitted personal testimonies to the Bureau of Military History, where they remained sealed for nearly 50 years. By far the best known of our 7 women is Constance Markievicz, one of the leading female activists of her time. Born in 1868 into a life of Anglo-Irish privilege, she went on to embrace the cause of Irish nationalism and the rights of workers. During the Dublin lockout of 1913, she established a soup kitchen in Liberty Hall to feed the families of striking workers. Through this work, she met the socialist and feminist James Connolly and joined him on the path to revolution.
There's a lot of criticism of her today as a dilettante. I think that dates partly from the period, but also more especially from Fiona Shaw's biography of her. And it was very much a case of putting women back in their box.
I think Whelan's biography of Markievicz set a kind of template for the way that a lot of the women, particularly Markievicz, were going to be remembered. What he had to say about Markievicz did not reflect most of what was said about the people who knew her, particularly the women who knew her.
One such woman was Helena Maloney. In an angry letter to O'Faolain, she condemned his patronising 1934 biography of Markievicz as both an attack on a friend and on Irish women in general.
It is a curious thing that many men seem to be unable to believe that any woman can embrace an ideal, that any serious thing a woman does, outside nursing babies or washing pots, is the result of being in love with some man, or looking for some excitement, or limelight, or indulging their vanity. You do not seem to have escaped the limitations of your sex. Therefore, you describe Madam as being caught up by, or rallying to, the side of Connolly and Larkin, or some man or other. Whereas the simple fact is that she was working, as a man might have worked, for the freedom of Ireland.
Markievicz certainly had her critics, but even those who questioned her motives did not deny her courage.
I knew quite a few people who knew the Countess Markievicz, and they thought the sun, moon and stars shone out of her, and they idolised the woman. And these were very tough, independently minded working class men who wouldn't show social deference to anyone. So I'm inclined, if people like that thought she was so wonderful, that there must have been some substance to what they felt.
At midday on Monday the 24th of April, the rising began. The rebels dispersed throughout the city, with the GPO quickly taken. From there, the proclamation was read, asserting the Irish Republic as a sovereign, independent state. Other buildings in Dublin were also occupied and turned into garrisons in preparation for the inevitable British onslaught. In later years, Markievicz recalled her role as a staff lieutenant in the citizen army during Easter week.
When I reported to Commandant Mallon at Stephen's Green, he said that owing to MacNeill's calling off the volunteers, a lot of the men who should have been under him had to be distributed round other posts, and that few of those left to him were trained to shoot, so I must stay and be ready to take on the work of a sniper. He took me round the green and showed me how the barricading of the gates and the digging trenches had begun, and he left me in charge. This work was very exciting when the fighting began. I continued round and round the green, reporting back if anything was wanted, or tackling any sniper who was particularly objectionable.
Like her friend, Countess Markievicz, Helena Maloney was also a member of James Connolly's Citizen Army. A talented and multifaceted woman, Maloney was an Abbey Theatre actress, a socialist, trade unionist, and also edited the monthly nationalist newspaper, Ban na Héireann.
She's actually one of the best examples of a woman, and I think it radiates throughout her witness statement, for example, who saw national freedom, freedom for women, and class freedom as synonymous.
She lived a very unorthodox life herself. She associated with artists, and she was often of no fixed abode, so she was sort of moving around a lot. And she would definitely have been at the top end of the radical spectrum. So the women involved in the Citizen Army, I would say, they were less typical, if you like, of those involved in Cumann na mBan. She was a woman who didn't see the same sort of boundaries in terms of women being involved in physical violence or being militarised.
Maloney was part of the Citizen Army unit of 20 men and 9 women ordered to take Dublin Castle on Easter Monday. Her Bureau of Military History account describes the first killing of the rebellion.
We went right up to the castle gate. Just then, a police sergeant came out When Connolly went to go past him, the sergeant put out his arm. When I saw Connolly draw his revolver, I drew my own. Connolly shot him dead. When the military guard saw that it was serious, he pulled the gates to. The sentry began firing. Sean Connolly said, "Get into the City Hall."
Women who desired a direct military role joined the citizen army rather than coming on. Its leader, James Connolly, handed out revolvers to the women on Easter Monday. One female combatant was Margaret Skinner. Born in Scotland in 1893 to Irish parents, she grew up steeped in the traditions of Irish republicanism. A maths teacher and member of both a women's rifle club and Cumann in Glasgow, she would later become president of the Irish National Teachers' Organisation. Before the Rising, Skinner couriered ammunition and detonators across the Irish Sea. A crack shot, she was in the thick of the action as both a dispatch rider and sniper.
Margaret Skinner is very interesting because she gives us one of the first accounts of the Rising. Her account of what happened was published in 1917.
Margaret Skinner wrote a memoir that some people would call pretty bloodthirsty. She really was out to kill. She loved the idea of shooting, and she keeps talking about, freeing Ireland and independent Ireland. But as I read her memoir, it seemed to me that the subtext was really much more interesting. And what was really being liberated was Margaret Skinner herself.
I was detailed as dispatch rider for the St. Stephen's Green Command. Motor cars and drays passing the green were commandeered to form a barricade, much to the bewilderment of their occupants, who had no warning anything was amiss in Dublin. Men in green uniforms would signal them to stop. One drayman refused his cart, persisted in his refusal, not believing it when our men told him this was war. He was shot.
Whether nationalist or unionist, few of Dublin's citizens supported the Rising. One person who vehemently opposed it witnessed the events at close quarters. Elsie Mahaffey was the unmarried daughter of Trinity College's provost, John Pentland Mahaffey, and they lived on the university's campus just a short distance from the rebel headquarters at the GPO. She methodically chronicled what she saw and heard.
Gradually, more news came through. The rebels had taken and fortified themselves several other places in Dublin. The South Dublin Workhouse, the Four Courts, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, Harcourt Street and Westland Row stations, the City Hall, and just opposite the office of the Daily Express.
All the bridges and roads leading out of Dublin were guarded and barricaded by them. The telegraph wires had been cut so that Dublin was isolated.
Numerous rebel garrisons had by now been firmly established throughout the city. But for the women, this was cold comfort. Their role in the rebellion was threatened by some of the same volunteers they wished to fight alongside.
Women were very much an afterthought, so they had a tough job getting their foot in the door for the Easter Rising. De Valera famously wouldn't let women in. I don't think that Ned Daly wanted them, Eamon Kent. A lot of them congregated in the GPO.
For rebel women, the Rising was something that had to be reached in a very immediate physical way. Catherine Byrne kicked in a window into the GPO, jumped through it and landed on top of another volunteer. That was a very dramatic kind of access. That negotiation at the threshold, I think, is very important. You don't see that in men's memoirs, but for women, there's always a matter of how can I become part of this?
You've got people like Helena Maloney that say, with that, I can do anything. I don't believe in the gender boundaries that are presented to me. And then you've got very conservative men who feel, it was okay once you were within the parameters of raising money for me. But if you are here fighting alongside me, you violate everything I think I'm fighting for. I'm fighting for a country where you don't have to do this.
Owing to secrecy or overprotectiveness, Leslie Price's two volunteer brothers never told her that the rebellion was imminent. training to be a teacher at the time, the 21-year-old Cumann member was determined to do her bit, despite male opposition.
A message had come to say that we were to disband, go home and await further instructions. You know the volunteers, the sort of men they were. They thought that we should be away from all the danger. Breach Dixon and I decided that we were not going home. Here was something that would never happen in our lives again. Breach Dixon and I walked down O'Connell Street and went into the post office.
Not all women involved in the rising were members of Cumann or the Citizen Army. Some were ordinary civilians, stirred by the centuries-old dream of expelling the British from Ireland. Aoife de Burke, a nurse, was attending to patients in North Dublin when she learned of the rebellion. And although not a member of any nationalist organisation, her brother Frank was amongst the volunteers that took the GPO on Easter Monday. De Burke would soon join him.
A young woman came towards me. She told me what had happened. I listened to her. And as I did, I felt that my heart gave a great throb of mingled joy and pain. Joy, because there was another blow being struck for the grand old cause of Irish freedom, for which so many martyrs and heroes had fought and died. Pain, because I knew not the fate of dear friends whom I felt would be involved therein.
Aoife de Burke was so committed to doing something that she hired a taxi to bring her into Dublin with all her luggage to join in.
But not all of our rebel women were keen on the insurrection. A close friend of Padraig Pearse made her way to the GPO with a great deal of reservation. Louise Gavin Duffy, the daughter of a celebrated Irish nationalist, was an educator and champion of the Irish language. She would later establish her own Irish school for girls.
Louise Gavin Duffy is brought up mainly outside Ireland. She understands Irish nationalism through her family connections, but she is brought into Irish nationalism through being exposed to the Irish language. So she's very active in the Gaelic League. She is one of Pearse's major funders for his educational programs. She's one of the co-founders of Cumann, and she is herself involved in the Easter Rising in the GPO.
I was not hindered in any way on my journey. I saw nothing unusual, except, I suppose, empty streets. I heard no shooting at that stage. When I got to the GPO, I was let in. I asked to see Mr. Pearse. He was as calm and courteous as ever. I think now it was very insolent of me, because I told him that I wanted to be in the field, but that I felt that the rebellion was a frightful mistake, because it could not possibly succeed and was therefore wrong. I told him that I would not like to do any active work. I suppose what I meant was that I wouldn't like to be sent with dispatches or anything like that, as I felt it would not be justified. He asked me would I like to go to the kitchens.
While de Burke, Price and Gavin Duffy settled into their assigned roles here in the rebel headquarters, less than a mile away at City Hall, Helena Maloney and her compatriots prepared for a violent and bloody British assault.
We got ready for the wounded. We sat pretty for a couple of hours. I and Ginny Shanahan went to the roof and talked to the men there. The firing had opened. It was very heavy for the first hour. Soon after that, at 2 o'clock, Sean Connolly, who was on the roof, was hit by a stray bullet and killed. I said the act of contrition into his ear. He had no priest. We were very distressed. After Connolly's death, there was nothing to do, only sit.
Among the female rebels was a teenager, Mary McLaughlin. Her family was deeply involved in the trade union movement and experienced the deprivations of the 1913 lockout. In 1954, in poor health and with only weeks to live, she shared her story with James Connolly's daughter, Ina.
In 1916, I was a member of Clan na Gael, and I was about 15 years of age. The first military post we reached was that of St. Stephen's Green, and we were introduced to Countess Markievicz and put at her service. By this time, some of our members got frightened, as they were very young, about 12 years of age. Some of the parents came to take the children home.
But Mary did not go home. It wasn't long before she was delivering dispatches between the Stephen's Green garrison and the GPO. By Monday nightfall, the British military had surrounded City Hall. For Helena Maloney and the rebels inside, there was nothing to do but wait for the attack.
We saw a large company, probably about 100 men, going into the castle. At about 8:30 or 9 o'clock, there was a bombardment. It came suddenly on us. There were machine gun bullets pouring in. A window was smashed at the back. And then we knew they were pouring in. A voice said, "Surrender in the name of the King."
The battle for City Hall and the assault on rebel outposts in the immediate vicinity was fierce and bloody. Nearby, the citizen army had secured Stephen's Green. Skinner slept, but Markievicz could not. Markievicz's restlessness was perhaps unsurprising. Earlier in the day, one of the rising's most controversial killings occurred at Stephen's Green. A Jubilee nurse, Geraldine Fitzgerald, witnessed the incident. The feathers were the only feminine feature in her appearance. Holding a revolver in one hand and a cigarette in the other, we recognized her as the Countess Markievicz. We had only been looking out a few minutes when we saw a policeman walking down the footpath. He had only gone a short way when we heard a shot and then saw him fall.
What shocked her, I think, as much as the killing itself was the fact that Countess Markievicz then shouted, "I got him." And then other members of the citizen army contingent around her shook her hands and congratulated her on the killing.
If you look at the policemen who were shot on Easter Monday when the rising breaks out, there is a connection between the Irish Citizen Army and these shootings. They seem to be more to the fore. That might be because of the lockout to a certain extent. And when Connolly was asked, what should we do about the policemen, he's alleged to have said, remember 1913. So it might have been that within the Citizen Army there was more of a political context that allowed for these kind of shootings to take place.
As Tuesday morning dawned, the rebels in Stephen's Green came under heavy and sustained gunfire.
As it was, our entrenchments and barricades proved of no avail. We realised at once we would have to evacuate the Green and retire to the College of Surgeons. One of our boys was killed before we got inside the College of Surgeons. The British gunners had been better trained at their task. We might have lost more, for we were completely at their mercy from the moment they began to fire down until the big door of the college closed.
The rebels may have found cover from enemy fire, but provisions in their new garrison were non-existent.
On Tuesday, we were joined by some of our men who had been in other places, and by quite a large squad of volunteers. And with this increase in our numbers, the problem of food became very serious. Nellie Gifford was put in charge of one large classroom with a big grate. When we were all starving, she produced a quantity of oatmeal from somewhere and made pot after pot of the most delicious porridge, which kept us going. But all the same, on Tuesday and Wednesday, we absolutely starved.
You get this sense of total chaos. You've got people wandering around not knowing where they're supposed to be. They've planned for some aspects, like, for example, bandages, but they haven't planned for food. You know, in a sense, they're amateurs at this.
Tuesday morning also saw the British military sweep down towards College Green, clearing pockets of resistance as they did. Their sights were now firmly set on enemy positions on the north side of the Liffey, especially the GPO.
About 4 o'clock, to my intense relief, I heard at last the regular march of soldiers. And looking down, I saw in the street below a multitude of khaki-clad men coming into college, and I flew down to hear some news. In the library, with my father, I found Colonel Porter. His first inquiries were for a map of Dublin and a high tower from which to prospect his field of action. And he asked my father advice as to where he ought to place the 18-pounders to blow down Liberty Hall.
I thought that was very interesting, really, just for the collusion of the academic world and the military world, that the provost, with his background in classics and philosophy, is giving advice about weapons. That surprised me very much, but Elsie talks about that. So it's not just public space, it's military camp.
Wednesday morning saw Margaret Skinner and the rebels in the College of Surgeons face into another day of meagre rations. But their will to fight on remained strong.
I climbed up astride the rafters and was assigned a loophole which to shoot. It was dark there, but it was good to be in action. More than once I saw the man I aimed at fall. Every shot we fired was a declaration to the world that Ireland, a small country but large in our hearts, was demanding her independence.
The 1916 Proclamation promised equal rights and equal opportunities to all its citizens. For the estimated 200 women involved in the rising, they were not just fighting for an Irish republic, they were also fighting to establish their right to be equal citizens.
The Proclamation of 1916, which offered unequivocal equality irrespective of sex and religion, was thrilling.
It was the best time of their lives for many of them, and they look back on it very fondly as that.
A lot of these women were very determined, and they insisted that they should play a part, even though many within the Irish Volunteers would have felt that they should be shielded from danger.
As day turned to night on Wednesday, the 26th of April, the British had the rebels firmly pinned down within the walls of the College of Surgeons. Desperate to boost morale, one of our women volunteered to lead a dangerous mission. On Wednesday night, Skinner led an attack on a British position on Harcourt Street. Up to now, she had evaded enemy fire. In her account of the rising, Skinner recalled what happened next.
It took just a few moments to reach the building we were to set afire. Councillor Partridge smashed the glass door in front of a shop that occupied the ground floor. He did it with the butt of his rifle, and a flash followed. It had been discharged. I rushed past him into the doorway of the shop, calling the others to come in. Behind me came the sound of a volley, and I fell. Before another volley could be fired, Mr. Partridge lifted and carried me onto the street. There on the sidewalk lay a dark figure in a pool of blood. It was Frank Ryan, mere lad of 17 who'd wanted to come with us as a party of 4.
While Skinner was carried back to the College of Surgeons, other women continued to run the gauntlet of British snipers.
The roles that women took on during Easter week were actually very dangerous. I mean, you were probably much safer sitting inside the GPO than you were going from garrison to garrison carrying messages. And there's lots of accounts of women who come under fire and so on during Easter week.
To read a history about 1916 where you talk simply about the volunteers and the fight for an Irish independent state, and to abstract wider debates about what role should women play in that, what does equality mean, what does franchise mean, that it makes no sense, because it would have made no sense to the contemporaries. They would have read this and they've gone, what? That's not the week that I experienced. That I don't understand or recognise this very tidy story that we've presented, because in fact it's an incredibly messy, much more exciting story than it's often presented as.
They certainly showed courage and bravery, and the roles that they played were in some respects as important as the roles of the men within the garrisons. What's important though, I suppose, is that they're given less value.
Leslie Price's testimony underlines the great danger the women put themselves in.
I remember we were sent with ammunition to Diarmuid Hegarty in North King Street from the post office. The headquarters on Church Street was the Father Matthew Hall, and in the Father Matthew Hall we saw Ned Daly and handed over the ammunition. We did not delay long and went back by the same route to the post office. We had done our midnight job so well and got back so easily that John McDermott said up in the dining room that we were to be treated as officers. We were promoted on the field. When we went up to Louise Gavin Duffy, she said that officers were to be given separate tables, and we were given a table to ourselves. We thought it was marvellous.
Elsie Mahaffey, the daughter of the Trinity College Provost, witnessed the arrival of British Army reinforcements and what was to follow.
Very early on Thursday morning, we heard the noise of the heavy guns coming into Trinity College. At a little after 7:30, the pounding down of Liberty Hall began. It lasted some half an hour and was indeed dreadful. The solid Provost's house trembled, and in the garden, all the birds who had sung and warbled so sweetly on previous mornings became mute, huddling together in terrified clusters.
On Thursday, the British Army tightened its perimeter around the GPO. Soldiers took up positions in the buildings along Sackville Street and Abbey Street. That afternoon, a British sniper shot James Connolly as he checked on some outposts. Aoife de Burke tended his wounds.
The bone was broken and the flesh very much lacerated. He seemed in great pain. I took off his boot and sock and helped to dress the wound. He was very brave and so grateful for the least attention. I well recollect praising the bravery of his men to him, saying what fine fellows they were and what spirit and courage they showed. "Oh," he said, "you needn't tell me. I know well their worth." And the tears coursed down his cheeks. I couldn't scarce keep back my own.
As the British cleared rebel positions street by street, the women acting as couriers continued to make increasingly perilous trips between the various garrisons. On one such journey, young Mary McLaughlin made a surprise discovery.
Coming through the lane into Abbey Street, I spied a revolver on the ground. I picked it up. I had to go along a roundabout way to get to Jacobs, finding I couldn't get through to Jacobs. And as I was in the neighbourhood of North King Street, where my home was, I thought I'd go home, see my mother, and hear all about the rest of the family.
Mary's mother, who up to that point didn't know if her daughter was alive or dead, immediately locked McLaughlin in her bedroom, but she soon made her escape.
It didn't take me long to get out the window into Henrietta Street, off King Street, and I made my way back to the GPO again. On entering the building, I held up this Fiona boy I knew with the revolver. With that, an elderly man put his hand on my shoulder, saying, "Don't do that to anyone, not even in fun." He asked me where I got the gun. I said in Abbey Street. This was Tom Clark, and he told me I had to give the gun up to James Connolly myself. I did so, and James Connolly, who was lying on a stretcher, held my hand, saying the gun couldn't have been in better hands.
Within the GPO, although there's been very little direct fighting, you've got huge kind of mental pressure, you've got hunger, exhaustion, sleeplessness, and there's a lot of praying.
And if you think about the role of religion in the middle of 1916 and the role of piety and devotion, the people who go out in 1916 and kill, it's very important that they can be absolved. For many of them, they are profoundly troubled by that they take a life.
Realising time was running out in the GPO, Tom Clark dispatched Leslie Price to the nearby Pro Cathedral to find a priest for his men.
Tom Clark looked at me. He had sort of steely eyes. I could have cried, but when I looked at his courageous old face, I said, "All right." I did not cry. I went to the small door on Henry Street that opens opposite Moore Street. Whoever was on the door must have seen I was terrified at my job.
Price ran to the top of Moore Street. A group of drunks who had looted Conway's pub confronted her, but she did not stop, continuing to O'Connell Street. People yelled at her from windows to get off the street as the British were closing in. Undeterred, she dashed across to the other side of O'Connell Street, towards the Pro Cathedral.
I got safely to the door of the presbytery. I kicked the door. I kicked, and finally a voice asked, "Who is there?" I said, "I've come from the post office." I said, "I've been sent over by Tom Clark for the priest." He said, "You're not going to the post office. You're staying here. No one here will go into the post office. Let those people be burned to death. They are murderers." I said, "If no priest is going to the post office, then I'm going back alone. I feel sure that every man in the post office is prepared to die to meet his God. But it's great consolation to any dying man to have a priest near him." Whatever effect I had on him, he said, "Very well, I will go."
The relentless British shelling of rebel positions set fire to numerous buildings. It was only a matter of time before the rebel headquarters suffered a similar fate. Concerned for the women's safety, Padraig Pearse instructed them to leave the GPO. His friend Louise Gavin Duffy challenged his decision.
We went to Mr. Pearse and told him that we didn't want to go, that we wanted to stay. We went back and resumed our occupations because Pearse said we could stay. He said that he did not think he had any right to prevent anybody from taking part in the rebellion who wanted to stay.
The GPO itself becomes cut off, and it becomes increasingly difficult for women, and it's primarily women, to keep the communications open. You've got this constant sense of when are the troops going to come.
Thursday evening, all the big fires started on the opposite side of the street. And by night, Cleary's, the Dublin Bread Company, and all that block of buildings were a mass of flames. I could not help thinking our turn would come soon, and that we would be burned like rats in a trap.
By Friday, British troop numbers in the city had swelled to 16,000 men. The rebels were outnumbered by a factor of over 15 to 1. In the GPO, nurse Aoife de Burka noted the growing anxiety of the rebel leaders.
Word had gone round that the British forces were closing in about us. I heard Tom Clark say as he passed along, "Things are looking serious now. We are surrounded."
According to Elsie Mahaffey, the rebels had every reason to be concerned.
Clearing up of the slums around college still went on all morning. At luncheon, several different officers came in from this disagreeable part of their duty. Each had to shoot someone for having arms in his house. After luncheon, the time was ripe to attack the rebel headquarters in the General Post Office.
Our hour had now come. The rebels had theirs, their supreme moment, as they called it on Monday. A big gun was stationed at the northern end of Sackville Street under the sheltering auspices of Parnell's monument. It dropped shells on the post office roof.
It's clear from her diary that Elsie Mahaffey, she's not the world's most pleasant person, but she knew intuitively right from the start how important all these events were, and she wanted to get it all down for the record.
I think Elsie Mahaffey's attitude to the rebels is, entirely understandable. She's really just reflecting the hostility that a lot of unionists would have had. Well, these views would have been shared by many Home Rulers as well. And I think what's particularly important and sometimes easy to lose sight of is the wartime context. If you look at the kind of press reports of Easter week, there's an immediate suspicion that the Germans are involved in this. There's rumours about some kind of socialist or communist conspiracy. So it's quite important to realise that no one really quite knows what's going on.
In the chaos of the GPO, Leslie Price and the other women were finally ordered to leave by Padraig Pearse.
He didn't say that it was the end or anything, but he said we need to evacuate all of you, and the best thing you can do is to bring our wounded to Jervis Street Hospital.
Between 3 and 4 p.m, I got the smell of burning and knew the GPO had taken fire. About this time, the shelling was terrific. I remember a volunteer asking me would I say the rosary with him at his post of duty. I did so and got some other girls to join. He was on guard right under a window. I'm sorry to say he was shot in the rush out from headquarters. Poor fellow. The rosary he asked me to say with him was probably his last. And fervently he said it.
By Friday evening, De Bourke, Price, Gavin Duffy, and the other women in the GPO were forced to leave the burning post office, accompanied by some men carrying the wounded.
The last person I saw leaving the post office was Tom Clark. He shook me by the hand and he said, "If you see my wife," and he stopped for a minute and he continued, "Tell her the men were wonderful to the..." And then he stopped and said goodbye. And I knew he meant end. I could see he was very pent up, but I was very, very proud of the fact that they had held up for the week.
The evacuees made their escape through the buildings adjoining the rear of the GPO. But their progress was impeded by ferocious British shelling and gunfire. Father Flanagan held a white flag, but this did not guarantee safety from sniper fire or shelling.
We then proceeded on our way and were nearing our journey's end when a voice shouted out, "Halt or I fire!" We halted, and Father O'Flanagan answered back, "Wounded men and nurses for Jervis Street Hospital." For some time, neither seemed to catch what the other was saying. At last we got the order to proceed. We were admitted into a room at the right side of the hall, where a guard of 6 soldiers were placed around us. All this time we could hear the big guns rattling away and see the reflection of the fires through the hall window. In fact, the flames seemed dangerously near us.
With the GPO now ablaze, the rebel leadership and the remaining volunteers fled the building, only to run into a wall of sustained British fire. Those not killed took refuge in a row of houses on Moore Street.
Certainly the leaders expected the GPO would be like the Alamo. They would make a defiant last stand. The withdrawal and the desperate march to Moore Street wasn't something that had been planned by the rebels, but something that was made inevitable by the fact that the GPO would essentially become a kind of inferno by the Friday of Easter week.
After 5 days of slipping through enemy lines and dodging sniper bullets, young Mary McLaughlin's luck finally ran out. She was taken into custody at a British military checkpoint and sent to a local soldier's home for her own safety.
The next day, the soldier, who was a sergeant, brought me to the gate of Ship Street Barracks and I was brought before Lord Power's court. He asked me what had me on that side of the city. I said I was coming from school. He gave me a pass that got me through the barricade.
On the afternoon of Saturday, the 29th of April, in an effort to avoid further loss of life, Padraig Pearse, accompanied by nurse Elizabeth O'Farrell, went to General Lowe and surrendered unconditionally. The rising had lasted less than 6 days.
And I got down to Church Street, where I met volunteers who'd evacuated the forecourts, and they told me that the rebellion was over. I then made my way towards my home, but I found it was occupied by the military who had evacuated the family to Bolton Street Technical School. I was brought there too, for safety. Here ended my fight for Irish freedom in Easter week, 1916.
Somebody told us about the surrender. I did not know when we were leaving that they were going to surrender. I thought we were leaving the post office and going somewhere else. Certainly didn't have the impression that it was all at an end.
I climbed to the top story of a house on the north side of the front court to look up Sackville Street at the post office. An inexcusable and dreadful sight which makes one hate being Irish. The fine old street is no more up to Nelson's Pillar. It is a smoking ruin, still in parts a blazing ruin. A blazing April sun throws a fierce and pitiless light on this shameful scene of Irish folly. Not one creature can be better for all this butchery and cruel destruction of property. The sum of honest labours of years thrown away in a few days of madness. It made me so sad.
If you look at Elsie Mulhaffy's diary, you get a wonderful sense of that kind of shock and dismay. Dismay that this is being played out on the streets of Dublin. And for a lot of people, of course, the rising happening when it did was the ultimate act of disloyalty. So she would represent, if you like, I'd say probably quite a significant silent body of the Unionist opinion.
While the ruined buildings around the GPO smouldered, news of the surrender was slow to reach the other rebel garrisons.
Sunday morning, one of the dispatch girls, waiting scared because she'd been escorted to our fort by British soldiers, came from headquarters to inform Commandant Mallon that a general surrender had been decided on. The Commandant and Madam were in my room at the time, and Madam instantly grew pale. Surrender? We'll never surrender. It would be better, she said, for all of us to be killed at our posts. Well, I felt as she did about it.
On the orders of Commandant Mallon, the College of Surgeons garrison did surrender. Skinner was taken to nearby St. Vincent's Hospital for medical attention.
As I said goodbye to Commandant Mallon, I had a feeling I would never see him again. Not that it entered my head for a moment he would be executed by the British.
In the days that followed, the British established a military court. 90 captured rebels were sentenced to death, though only 15 executions were carried out.
Ready! Despite all our wrongs and their injustices, I did not dream of them killing prisoners of war.
Fire!
As one of the leaders of the rebellion, Countess Markievicz was also sentenced to death, but this was commuted to penal servitude for life on account of her sex. Under the general amnesty announced the following year, she was released and returned to Ireland to a hero's welcome. In 1918, as a Sinn Féin candidate, Markievicz would be the first woman elected to the House of Commons.
And that gives you a sense that perhaps 1916 led to great advances for women, but again, Markievicz was such an exceptional figure. I think it's more interesting to look at the 1918 election and to notice that only 2 women were actually put forward by Sinn Féin for seats, and one of those was in an unwinnable seat. The focus on Markievicz gives a misleading view that the rising led to a kind of a breakthrough for women. And it's certainly true that people could point to the rising and say, look at Markievicz, women played a full role, therefore they should get full equality afterwards. But that's certainly not what happened.
The memory of Easter week with its heroic dead is sacred to us who survived. Our efforts will inspire people who come after us and will give them hope and courage. If we failed to win, so did the English.
Participation in the Easter Rising did advance women's claims for political equality in Ireland. But I think those gains, and there were gains for a few years after 1916, stalled.
They lose a lot, I think, in the long run, particularly those women who are radicalised to the point that they are not pro-treaty when the time comes, that they're the ones who end up standing outside the state because the state does not become the republic they think they fought for. Many of them lose their jobs, many of them lose their partners and their breadwinners, many of them become impoverished, many of them become socially ostracised. A significant number of them emigrate.
They thought we could achieve more if we had our full freedom, freedom from home, freedom from the constraints we suffer now, and didn't realise that that wasn't where they were heading. They were heading into a bigger prison, a worse prison in some respects than the one they were trying to escape. There was no home for them in the Free State. It was still a cold place to live.
When the histories of the Easter Rising were written, with the exception of Countess Markievicz, the women involved were rarely mentioned or were relegated to a token page or paragraph.
One of the most famous photographs of the Easter Rising is the surrender. You can see Patrick Pearse surrendering to General Lowe. But if you look closely in some versions of the photograph, you can see Elizabeth O'Farrell's feet. It's not clear why Elizabeth O'Farrell was removed from the picture. It may have been a decision made by the newspaper, but her removal has come to symbolise the position of women in the Easter Rising.
It's not just that women's role was not recognised, let's put it that way. It's that they were actively airbrushed. And not only that, but that takes a lot of work.
Before they evacuated the GPO, Padraig Pearse praised their contribution. He told the women that were it not for them, the fight could not have lasted so long, and that when the history of that week would be written, the highest honour and credit should be given to the women.